Hello, everyone, and welcome to this podcast introduction to this week's Thomas Jefferson Hour. I just want to take a moment to talk about the extraordinary new directions that the Jefferson Hour is taking and to encourage you to help us along with your thoughts, themes, things we should think and talk about, people we should interview, your questions, and possibly also your financial help and contributions. But mostly, I'm just eager to talk with you about where things are. I had a great week this week. I'm in Bismarck. I had the chance to talk with Ed Watts of the University of California, San Diego, the author of Mortal Republic, which is really a remarkable book about the last days of the Roman Republic. And he's somebody that I've interviewed before for governing. But now with the new expanded vision of the Jefferson Hour, we'll be kind of moving out from just the life and times of Jefferson into a much broader brush, a wider lens, a set of lenses. And this interview was really what I most want to do in the world. So here's this man, Grant Zazula, who's doing remarkable things up in the Yukon. I had never heard of him, but I had heard of these mammoth finds, particularly in Siberia. In fact, 18 or so years ago on the Jefferson Hour, Tracy Panzarella era, we interviewed an American paleontologist who had helped to unearth a complete mammoth in ice in Siberia. That was an extraordinary interview. And so now when I saw the news that this baby mummified mammoth had been found in the Yukon, I contacted Grant Zazula's communications people, and they were a little concerned because there's a lot of important work to be done with the indigenous people of that region, even after they're turning me down and said, I'm just so interested in this because Jefferson was fascinated by the mammoth. And I mentioned that in his 250-word vocabulary list that he sent up the river with Meriwether Lewis, that mammoth was one of the words. He wanted to find out the Nez Perce word for mammoth and the Chinook word for mammoth and the Lakota word for mammoth and the Mandan word for mammoth and so on. I don't think that Lewis had much success on that front, but it shows you something first about Jefferson's deep childlike curiosity and stubbornness, by the way, but it also tells you something about how little we knew in the Enlightenment. Jefferson really doubted the idea of extinction. So imagine what has changed in the way we see history, geology, the chain of being, creation, the beginnings of the world, evolution, extinction, since the time of Thomas Jefferson. I wrote a couple of letters, actually, to Dr. Zazula's staff, and finally they said, he is kind of interested in talking about this, especially with the Jefferson angle. Thanks to Zoom technology, which has revolutionized my life, I can tell you that, we had this great interview. I could see him. He held up a green 3D model of a mastodon tooth. He held up the jaw of a wolf. There he was, as if he was in the next room. We had this incredible conversation. All that we're going to be doing in the next years is based in Jefferson, America's Renaissance man, curious in almost every direction, fascinated about the possible futures for the American Republic. So it's grounded and founded in Jefferson, but I want to explore so many extraordinary themes with you and to introduce you to some of the most interesting people in the world who are working in what might be called a Jeffersonian world. For me, it's just like the best kind of continuing education. I'm learning an extraordinary amount, and I'm so thankful to Dr. Zazula for being willing to sit down with me in this interview. So that's where we're headed. I hope you like it. We need your help in all sorts of ways. David Swenson is on a prolonged break. He'll be coming back to do the Joe Ellis shows, and we'll just follow this as it proceeds. But meanwhile, we have lots of guests. My daughter is doing some of the guest hosting, and of course Lindsay Chervinsky is a frequent guest on this program, and David Nicandri is coming on soon to talk about the discovery of the Endurance, the ship of Shackleton, that was discovered in 2023, I believe, in Antarctica. We always turn to David Nicandri on these Enlightenment questions. So please tell everyone you know. Send us your suggestions, your comments, your thoughts, your criticisms. Teach us, but keep listening, please. And I think we're heading into an extraordinary new era of the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Thanks. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the special edition of Listening to America, the Thomas Jefferson Hour. I'm Clay Jenkinson. Today, Jefferson and the woolly mammoth. Jefferson was absolutely fascinated like a 9-year-old with mastodons and mammoths and coerced his friends to dig bones at Big Bone Lick, Kentucky, and elsewhere. I had the great honor today of interviewing Grant Zazula, now widely known as the Yukon paleontologist, extraordinary man with great insights about the mammoth fascination in the era of Thomas Jefferson. So let's get started. Thanks for doing this. So you're kind of universally now known as the Yukon paleontologist, which is a pretty great moniker. And when I was reading about your work, of course, I'm thrilled and delighted by what you get to do. But I was also I had a little moment when I realized that a lot of this sort of rescue paleontology, as these placer hoses are breaking down whole walls of the permafrost. These are just the conditions under which you have to work.
It's the conditions we have to work, right? Without the gold mining, there would be no exposure into these hillsides. So it's a really interesting relationship. And that relationship with gold miners goes back right to the gold rush of 1898. And those amazing photos of these old timers with mammoth tusks and stuff. But yeah, so it really takes, there's a real kind of nuance to the relationship because Yukon has legislation that protects archaeological sites and fossil sites, paleontological sites. And we also have land claims with indigenous people, with indigenous communities. So both of those, so there's a couple different legislative kind of angles. And then we kind of work, practically work in this sort of area between working with First Nations and working with the gold mining community. And from our perspective, just trying to do the best we can to recover this material so it doesn't get lost. Because in a short summer in the Yukon, these gold miners they're going hard for 4 or 5 months, and night and day because it doesn't get dark, right? They have often night shifts, and we've really put a lot of our effort into building those relationships with the gold miners and letting them know about how important this is, not just for science and the Yukon, but globally, and the global interest in these kind of things. And so we have fairly good buy-in with the gold mining community for they're required when they uncover this material, they generally put it aside. If they see something spectacular, they give us a call. But our program, we have a few of us in the summer will kind of spend the summer driving around the gold fields in a big truck and visiting and showing up at these mines, and you really never know what to expect when you get there. Sometimes it's really spectacular. Other days are, oh, just a bunch more bison, just a bunch more horse, a bunch more mammoth. But every once in a while you get some pretty amazing stuff. And I think I really think there's something to this, that a lot of the gold miners, right, they're kind of like rough and tumble type people. They like to go hunting, they like animals, big animals. So I think there's this sort of connection with these big bones and big antlers and big tusks. And so I think they're quite fascinated by it. And we're often, for example, the gold mining, there's a lot of environmental things about it, right? They're blasting hillsides of permafrost away. So often the results of the paleontological research are kind of their best news stories, right? We're good PR for them because they get a lot of pressure from various environmental groups and other things like that. So when they are able to contribute to these scientific projects, it shows, well, they're actually being responsible in some way.
To get this straight, they're required by provincial or Canadian federal law to stop if they come upon something.
It's Yukon territorial law. Yeah.
All right.
So there's the law, the Historic Resources Act of Yukon, but it's also required through Indigenous land claims as well. Since 1996, our law came into effect, and that was the same time land claims were being negotiated. And now it's more seen as a kind of a co-management situation with the First Nations. Increasingly over the last couple years, First Nations have shown greater interest and capacity to help and be involved in these kind of projects and this kind of work. And that really, that all kind of came to pinnacle this summer with the discovery of the mummified baby mammoth Nuncho ga. And that really, maybe even backing it up a few years, in 2016, our team recovered a mummified wolf pup that was discovered in 2016. And And that one was a bit of a game changer in terms of the First Nations interest and relationship. And I think it was because, everyone can identify with a wolf, right? It's something that we have today still, but also First Nation communities here, their clan system is divided amongst kind of wolf clan or crow clan. So that notion of having these relationships with an animal like wolf really kind of captured their interest. And this being that wolf was 57,000 years old. And that really kind of got the wheels churning, I think, in a lot of the First Nations minds in terms of the relationship to paleontology. And then when Nuncho Ga was found this summer, that was a real pinnacle, I think. It's a total game changer for what we're going to be doing in the future.
So Thomas Jefferson believed that the mammoth might still be grazing out there somewhere. He had a hard time accepting the notion of extinction. So he's just about a half century before extinction really became well understood. And he believed in the great chain of being, and the analogy was that if any link in the chain disappeared, the whole chain would be called into question, and the creator had designed a perfect universe, and therefore he wouldn't, or it wouldn't, permit extinction, and so on. And so think of Meriwether Lewis out there in the wilds of Montana talking to Crow or Shoshone or Flathead or Nez Perce and saying, well, what's your word for mammoth? But here's what Jefferson wondered, and this is what I want to ask you. Do indigenous people have some sort of a cultural memory or some sort of echo of the mastodon and the mammoth?
They do. And they do for a number of reasons. There's a couple examples I'll talk about here. Besides the placer gold mining kind of work that we do, we also work very closely with a region called Old Crow, the northernmost Yukon. There's a community called Old Crow. It's about 250 people. That was also a community that was visited very early on, right after the gold rush. So the Smithsonian sent an expedition up there. They collected some pretty incredible stuff that's at the Smithsonian. The Old Crow people, they're really kind of the water, the rivers are very important to them. So they spent a lot of time traveling on the rivers. The thing that always gets me is that First Nation people are hunters, they're trappers. So their knowledge of skeletal anatomy is incredible. They know a femur, they know a humerus. You have to realize as they're going up and down the rivers and they see a femur bone that's 3 feet long, they know right away, oh, I know that's a leg bone of a big animal. And it's not I know what a moose looks like. It's something 10 times the size of a moose. So those stories are really embedded. These stories about these ancient monsters are really embedded in the community. Um, and there's a really good story that was told. Um, Really, the godfather of Canadian Ice Age paleontology, named Richard Harrington from the National Museum. In I think it was in 1967, one of his first trips to Old Crow, he was told about this monster that had broken out of the frozen bank and along a place called the Whitestone River, which is near Old Crow. And one of the elders said, this monster came out of the bank and it's there. So, anyways, a few days later, he boated up the river, and sure enough, exactly where it was supposed to be, there was a partial skeleton of a woolly mammoth, and it's known as the Whitestone mammoth. And the story to him was, there's this notion that these animals were kind of frozen in the ground. We have concepts of things being alive or dead, and my understanding of the story is that these animals were kind of in a sort of a purgatory, almost not alive, not quite dead, but in a frozen state, and then emerged from the ground in that sort of way. So that story has always been something that's really, really interesting. But a story that I recently learned about that I didn't realize, and I'll send you a link to this book. It's called Casca Tales. It's kind of just a small, like a children's book. It's got incredible stories told by an elder from Watson Lake about mammoths. And there's actually a word in there, a Casca, which are the people of eastern Yukon along the Mackenzie Mountains, essentially. They have these stories in this book about like shamans meeting mammoths out in the woods, and then be out of fear for their community, sort of freezing them back in the hillside. And then there's some other stories about these mammoths chasing and sort of harassing communities. A lot of scientists would go, those are nice stories. Those are kind of interesting stories, right? They may not have any scientific value, but I really think they do. And here's why. And I think this all kind of came full circle to me just in the last couple of years. With this discovery that we published a few years ago about late surviving mammoths and horses in the Yukon. So, by extracting fragments of DNA from the permafrost soil, it was learned that there was probably small pockets of mammoths still living in the Yukon up until 5 or 6 thousand years ago.
Wow.
So that's not long ago, in the sort of big picture, that's not very long ago. We know that like amongst indigenous people in North America, some oral histories, they go back thousands of years, and these stories have been passed on, and especially dramatic stories. And I'm sure mammoths would have been dramatic stories. 5,000 years ago, where people are situated today at, kind of typical communities of First Nations, there was people were in those places at that time, almost certainly were running into these animals, right? And they may have been small populations kind of left over from the end of the ice age, kind of residual populations, but I'm sure they left their mark on people in terms of the storytelling and just those encounters. Because remember, the people that entered North America from Eurasia, they were upper Paleolithic, for all intents and purposes, mammoth hunters, right? They were megafauna hunters, and so that cultural knowledge of those animals was certainly there, and it is certainly passed on for thousands of years. So I find that stuff really fascinating, and I would love to be able to explore some of that more. But yeah, I'm convinced that there were some of these stories have a lot of legitimacy, and they can tell us a lot about the history of mammoths.
We need to take a short break. I'm talking with Dr. Grant Zazula about mammoth excavations in the Yukon. We'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. I'm Clay Jenkinson, talking with Dr. Grant Zazula. I can tell you one thing. Jefferson would give anything to be part of this conversation. I want to ask him now about the implications of this sort of discovery for the future of paleontology. On the one hand, a hunter maybe 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago goes out and finds a giant bone. They know their bones, so they realize it's a femur or it's a tooth or whatever. A kind of imaginative reconstruction of what that creature must have been. And then stories growing up around that, like what was this monster and who stopped it and how was it a threat to our people and so on. That sounds very plausible to me, but you're saying that maybe Jefferson was right, that there might have been actual memory of actual encounters with live mammoths that may be somewhat garbled over time, but that this is something that you cannot rule out.
This goes back to the whole conversation about extinctions at the end of the Ice Age. There was a guy named Paul Martin back in the 60s who talked about this blitzkrieg overkill. He had this notion that when people entered North America for the first time, they were on this killing rampage essentially, and spread out across the continent, and every animal in their presence, suffered extinction, right? And we know now that that wasn't the case. These extinctions were staggered. They happened for different species at different times. But we also, I think, a lot of Ice Age paleontologists live in a bit of envy of dinosaur paleontologists, because there's this dramatic end to the dinosaurs with an asteroid wiping everything out, and then it's just like Terra Nova. It's a clean slate. Everything happens after that. And I think a lot of people who work in the Ice Age kind of had been hoping that there was some cataclysmic sort of end to the Ice Age animals. So I think now, as data sets are starting to be built up, showing the timing of some of these extinctions. There was a recent paper published about horses in Mexico extending well beyond the Ice Age as well. That these small isolated pockets of mammoths and horses and other Ice Age animals that would have carried on after the Ice Age. I think as more work gets done, we're going to start to discover more about some later surviving animals, and that definitely puts some of those animals in the time frame of human memory kind of deal. Yeah, I think the Ice Age extinction question is still well out there. Yeah, I think we're going to learn a lot more.
I don't know enough about Canadian Indigenous people, but I know a fair amount about Indigenous people in the United States, and it doesn't sound like their life ways to go into mass overkill. I mean, there's a whole set of restraining mechanisms in almost every indigenous culture that would have made that a near impossibility. It could happen accidentally, maybe, but it would never happen purposefully.
They didn't do that in Eurasia during the Ice Age. They didn't kill everything in their sites in Eurasia. So why would they all of a sudden switch in their, happen when they crossed the Bering Land Bridge into North America?
So you grew up in Edmonton, didn't you?
Yes, I did. Yeah.
I've never been. I've been to Calgary. I had a friend from Edmonton. She's now a Supreme Court justice in Canada. So when did you become fascinated by megafauna?
To be honest with you, I've kind of got into this stuff in very odd ways. I have a very distinct memory of being a young person, my parents taking us on a camping trip to Drumheller to go see the dinosaurs, right? And I remember just being young and fascinated by this notion of just walking around and picking up seeing these dinosaur bones. And I actually got into megafauna via archaeology. At the end of high school, we had to do some community volunteering, and I ended up volunteering at the provincial museum in Edmonton, and I was cataloging artifacts like stone tools and things like that. But there was all these, megafauna collections around. So as an undergraduate student, I was taking courses in archaeology. I have an undergraduate degree in archaeology, but at University of Alberta at the time, there was a real focus in northern studies. And especially the Yukon, there's a real connection to the Yukon. And one of the connections to the Yukon was some of the work at places like Old Crow, a site called Bluefish Caves, which is one of these really early archaeological sites in North America. And I was always just fascinated by this notion that this was a continent, almost like this Eden, Garden of Eden, with all these animals and this untouched ecosystem. And then all of a sudden, these first people walked into this. And that whole idea really fascinated me as a kid. I did a lot of archaeology, and then I soon found myself becoming more interested in the place rather than the people, and just trying to understand what that environment people would have interacted with, what it looked like, what were the plants, so I got into this actually via plants. I did paleoecology. I was studying ancient plant remains, palynology, and then I somehow ended up on a trajectory working out in the Klondike goldfields, because I was doing paleoecology work, and then I was invited to come up to Dawson City to come. It was a conference, and there was a field trip to one of these gold mines, and I just couldn't believe it. First summer in the Yukon, it was in Old Crow in 1999. I will never forget getting out of the helicopter and just walking along the riverbank for the first time and picking up a mammoth tooth. And it sort of validated all these stories that all these professors had said, like, that this was actually real. You could actually just walk along the riverbank and pick up mammoth tooth. And
just sitting there, just washed up.
Just sitting there waiting for someone to pick up. But then I ended up doing my PhD work on Arctic ground squirrels of the Ice Age, because we out in these gold mines in the permafrost, we started to find all these little preserved nests of Arctic ground squirrels that were, the remains of ground squirrels who collected nests and seeds. That was an incredible way to understand the ecosystem. So from there, I ended up getting a job with the Yukon government, and it just sort of I kind of, I'm not very. I kind of think about the big picture a lot, like how these things work, to the connectivity of these things, and I ended up getting into megafauna that way. It just, you start with these things are all connected: the people, the plants, the land, and then the animals and the climate. It's, it all works together. So I really kind of enjoy working in sort of an interdisciplinary kind of way with people who do different things and trying to put the whole story together. So yeah, that's kind of how I got there.
I want to talk to you a little bit about mummified remains. So about 20 years ago, I'm sure you know this story better than I do. In Siberia, a mammoth was found encased in ice, and the ice block was excavated and put in a refrigerated warehouse of some sort. And then they very cautiously began to chip away at it to excavate at least part of it. And in the end, they were so scared that they used a hairdryer and got, to one little spot on the flank of this thing. The paleontologist who was in charge said they could then smell the meat. So talk a little bit about the difference between fossilized remains and mummified remains.
The word fossil is sometimes a bit complicated or problematic, because in a kind of true sense, a fossil is really kind of any remains from an ancient plant or animal or any kind of ancient life. But yeah, mummified remains, those are the kind of things that when you see those images, right, they really just bring the whole story to life for you. And I know Dick Mole, who was involved in that excavation of that big permafrost block, and he's a good friend of mine and works with the program quite a bit. So I've heard these stories from some of our mentors about these Siberian permafrost mummies, and we've picked up every summer. The program collects something like 5, 6, 7,000 individual bone. It's remarkable how much is out there. The mummified remains are incredibly rare, especially in North America. It seems like in Siberia they find something mummified every year. Like it's really true how often they find them. I never ever thought I would see a real mummified woolly mammoth. It's not something I ever thought I'd see come out of the Yukon. You can learn a lot scientifically about these mummified animals. You can learn about how they died and why and all these kind of things. But I think for me, what they really do is that they really bring it to life. They bring the ice age to life. So you can show someone a mammoth tusk or a tooth or a bone. They're like, oh yeah, that's nice, that's cool. You show them the whole animal of something that's extinct, something that's been extinct for thousands of years, something that lived tens of thousands of years ago, and it just brings the whole picture together. It's a real privilege, I think, because getting a chance to interact with this, something like a mummified mammoth and be up and close and to touch it and to look it in the eye is something very few people have that an opportunity to do in their life, and it changes you. I think it really it deeply impacted me and everyone that I know that's been around the Nuncho Ga and any other mummified animal. It's really visceral. It's really, yeah, it's pretty spectacular.
Now, what's the right word for it? I mean, I think of awe, wonder, sacred.
It's breathtaking. And, for me, this summer with Nuncho Ga being discovered, seeing the impact that had on the First Nation community and the people we were working with is something I'll never ever forget. I saw an elder at the site bend over and pick up a piece of mammoth hair, from where the mammoth came from. And that kind of connection between people and land and biology and ancient animals is it's really profound. It's miraculous. It really is, because it makes you it makes you wonder how much more of that kind of stuff is under the ground, right? And in Siberia they're so often found kind of serendipitously, not unlike the gold mining situation. But for example, when Luba was found in 2007, she was found in 2007. There was a whole kind of odd series of events of her being found, and then the reindeer herder taking it back to the community, and it got chewed on by some dogs. And like, I've heard stories of people that work in Siberia, and they say, like, sometimes when mummified animals get found, like, the dogs get at them right away, and it's really unfortunate because you know um, but for example, with Nujo Ga, it was remarkable because there was a geologist on site that day to be able to describe, to do it properly. So we're gonna, yeah, it's remarkable. The, there isn't a single word to describe how remarkable it is, I think.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no question. So let's do a kind of hypothetical. Let's say that you get a call in June, and you go up there, and they pull a full sized mummified mammoth out of the side of the hill. What happens next? How is that preserved from putrefaction and so on?
In this situation, the great thing, and this was only possible because of the relationships that we've invested in with the gold miners, because within an hour of that animal coming out of the ground, I got a phone call, right? And that wouldn't have happened 10 years ago. It wouldn't happen 15 years ago. Um, but there's a lot of trust required, because there's a general perception out there that if you find something like this, the government's going to come and shut you down. And but in terms of this, she was in a freezer within, well, I think Ninchoga was found around 11 a.m. and by about 10 p.m. she was back in a freezer. So There was no worry about, like, there was no kind of degradation at all.
So if you found one and wound up in the Smithsonian, let's say, which is not necessarily the best thing for a Canadian
Yeah.
find, but could it be permanently displayed in some sort of refrigerated state?
Well, here's a good example. So Jur, the baby wolf pup that was found in 2016, she's on display at our museum at the Yukon Beringia Interpretive Center. And one of the things that happens in the permafrost, the kind of the taphonomy of these animals, is that it's sort of like it's slow freeze drying over tens of thousands of years. So the consistency, and this is where it's a little bit different than a lot of the materials that have been found in Siberia, where, for example, one of the more recent mummies of woolly mammoth, there was actually free flowing blood that came out of the animal. It was
Oh.
so the conditions of the permafrost in some of those sites in Siberia are quite different than our permafrost. So what seems to happen, like with the Jur, the wolf pup, it's a slow process of freeze drying. So basically, all the free moisture in the body tissues are slowly come out of the animal. So the consistency of her tissues, like her skin, is like an old dried shoe, or beef jerky, if you will. It's really it's very dry, so there's very little moisture in it. So once, like with Jur, we once she was found, she was kept in a freezer. There was a conservator that did some work to slowly dry her out and to slowly thaw her. And once they're thaw and kept dry, they're very, very stable. So we have the wolf pup on display. There's no kind of real climate controls because it's she's dried out. She's a dried out mummy. So there's really no concern. One of the things about Yukon is that we have very little relative humidity in the moisture in the air. So the air is really dry anyways. So as long as she's kept in stable temperature, kind of stable moisture regime, she's very stable. There's not a lot of worry. It doesn't need to be kept in some sort of frozen tomb or something like
In your imagination or in your dreams, what's the grail? What is it that what's the grail for you? What would you love to see in your lifetime?
that. Well, now that I kind of, we did have the opportunity to see the Holy Grail, I think this summer with
Yeah.
Nuncho Ga. Uh, you could top that by having a woolly mammoth mummified with a spear point in it.
Oh
So
wow.
if something like that would be found,
It's not beyond the realms
yeah,
of imagination, is it? It's not an impossibility to imagine you could find one with a point in it.
no, absolutely not. No, for example, like that mastodon that's been reported on from the Manus site in Washington. It's got the spear point embedded in its vertebra. People were interacting with these animals. They were hunting them. They were scavenging them. But there's other animals like mammoths and the common animals, mammoths, horses, and bison. Those are like 95% of what we find out there. But to find something like a mummified giant beaver, to me, I think that might be the holy grail. Like to find a giant beaver,
What's
frozen, full carcass.
what's the
Sig-
best beaver find that's happened up there?
Um, Well, we find fragments of giant beaver teeth and bones along the Old Crow River. And I have a this is a skull replica, but we have a really beautiful specimen of a partial, like just the mandible, the lower jaw with a complete tooth and everything, that was found by Dick Harrington, and that's one of the coolest fossils from the Yukon. I could send you
And
photos
what
of
is
this.
what is it?
It's the mandible of the giant beaver. So this is these are beavers that were 5-6 feet long. To
I,
find something like that mummified would be unreal.
Now here's my ignorance. I would assume that a mammoth is a relatively docile creature, but I don't want to encounter giant beaver.
Absolutely, they thrash around. But also, like, carnivores are so spectacular. When we find the bones of ice age carnivores like lions or scimitar cats. It's always really special because one out of every couple hundred fossils, or maybe five and one is a carnivore. So when they found the mummified lion cubs in Siberia a couple of years ago, that's pretty remarkable. I always say too, there's one species that was very common in the ice age of Siberia that we don't find in North America. And that's the woolly rhinoceros. And it's been the woolly rhinos are very common in Siberia. There's even been mummified woolly rhino carcasses found. In my mind, I still think that they may have crossed the Bering Land Bridge and entered into North America, maybe even small populations of them, because they're found right up to Chukotka, the eastern edge of the Russian Far East. It's kind of like a little bit of a needle in a haystack for some of these species. And when that needle gets found, it can really provide some really amazing information. So if we found a woolly rhino, that would be pretty awesome.
We need to take another short break. When we come back, I will tentatively raise the question of the Jurassic Park syndrome. Can we recreate megafauna like the mammoth using the DNA and the kind of technologies that we now are beginning to be able to apply to such species? You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. I'm Clay Jenkinson talking with Dr. Grant Zazula about mammoth findings in the Yukon. Absolutely extraordinary. So I take you now back to our interview. Let me ask a question about where we are with computing. So when someone like Charles Willson Peale finds a number of mastodon bones or mammoth bones, then they need a certain number to be able to figure out what it looked like, and they were often wrong, but they would piece it out and so on. Now, if you have these two hyena teeth, are we sophisticated enough that we can use algorithms and grow the shape of that thing, or do we need more than that?
Well, the thing is, like, for example, that hyena, those two hyena teeth, those are the only two that have been found in Yukon and Alaska. Other specimens of that species have been found in other places. So you can sort of using a bit of a jigsaw approach. Oh, there's some bones from Mexico and some from Mongolia and a few teeth from here. We can sort of put that together.
So Jefferson had a kind of 9-year-old's fascination with this. But you understand that kind of perpetual, almost childlike wonder that Jefferson had. And he talked his friends into digging up bones at Big Bone Lick and other places. And he offered a naval pump to Charles Willson Peale for his Hudson Valley excavation and so on. This was just before the coming of understanding of the dinosaur. And so Lewis and Clark found a plesiosaur bit in South Dakota. They just said big fish. They had no conceptual way of this. So what the dinosaur is to our time, the mammoth and the mastodon were to Jefferson's time. These gigantic, fascinating, now gone creatures that fill us with wonder and make us imagine a world that is not anything like the world that we see every day outside of Monticello, right?
But it is. It's not totally gone, and I think that's what the appeal is with mammoths and mastodon, is that they were just yesterday, and we're so closely connected to them as humans. We're not connected to dinosaurs because we're 65 million
That's
years
60
removed.
million years ago, right? But this is like 10,000 years ago.
Yeah, all of our ancestors hunted and interacted with these giant ice age megafauna. I think that's the appeal, and that's that connection to climate change, that observation. We can talk about climate change, but these fossils are the evidence of those changes in recent Earth history, right? And I think that's where it provides such a compelling kind of story narrative.
So why in Jefferson's time, the mastodon and the mammoth were distinct, but they were often kind of intermingled in the imagination, and mammoth became the term. For those of us who don't really understand the difference, what is the difference between the two species?
They're about 24 million years removed. Mammoths and mastodons are in very different evolutionary lineages, with mammoths being very much more closely related to living elephants, especially Asian elephants. But really, the key difference, if you have just parts of the postcranial, like the skeleton below the neck, they're hard to separate sometimes, right? They look superficially very similar. But where you see the difference is in their teeth, because the teeth really reflected different evolutionary history. And I always use the example up here because people are familiar with these animals. A mastodon is like a moose. It's a browser. It eats shrubs, it eats branches from trees, leaves on deciduous trees, spruce trees. just like a moose does. It browses in the boreal forest. It's a forest dwelling ancient elephant. Whereas mammoths are like the ultimate cows. They're just grazers. They're grazing on grass. They eat hundreds of kilograms of grass a day. So you can really see the difference reflected in their teeth, and those teeth reflect their evolutionary difference. So the it's really mastodons being browsers in a forest type environment, whereas mammoths are grazers in an open country.
24 million years separation, and they're thriving on Earth.
What's neat about mastodons is that their history, the first mastodons entered North America probably 15 million years ago, is kind of the understanding of when mastodon came into the new world. Mammoth history is very recent in North America. The first mammoths probably crossed the land bridge into North America maybe 1.5 million years ago. So what's neat about that is that we have these pictures of the Ice Age always dominated by the image of the mammoth, right? But actually, for most of the Ice Age in North America, there was no mammoths. There was, the Ice Age starts about 2.5 million years ago. If you looked around the Ice Age 2.5 million years ago in most places in North America, you'd see horses, you'd see camels, you wouldn't see any bison, and you wouldn't see any mammoth. Mammoths sweep into North America about 1.5 million years ago, and then they're just become this, iconic animal of North American Ice Age. But
I'm trying to imagine the paleo hunter. So if you're going to go out and get a mammoth, you don't go alone. This is not like going out deer hunting with your rifle. This is a group activity. Explain how that must have worked.
geez, I don't really know. Like, there's a lot of ideas. People aren't really sure how they would have been, maybe they would have driven them off, into drive lanes kind of thing, or little traps. But, in North America, there actually isn't very much evidence of actual mammoth hunting. A lot of people think that mammoth hunting would have been a very dangerous activity. They were obviously harvesting mammoths, but maybe they were scavenging mammoth carcasses that were killed by, say, a lion or a scimitar cat or something like that. Because if you look at these earliest archaeological sites, the Paleo-Indian sites, there's not a lot of evidence for actual mammoth hunting. There's more evidence in Eurasia during earlier parts of the human story, but it's kind of a bit of a myth that they were all hunting these mammoths, because I think we kind of like the idea of big guys with spears hunting mammoths. But the early people in North America had a pretty diverse diet. They were hunting and trapping a whole variety of animals. It wasn't just mammoths. So
So
I love the idea of these mammoth bone dwelling houses. Obviously, people were either scavenging or hunting them in big numbers because they were building houses out of them.
most of the things that you've been involved with have come about as a byproduct of this placer mining. Some things wash up along the Yukon and so on, but basically it's been this mining. What are the implications of global climate change for the future of your profession?
Well, I think a lot of the like you said, a lot of the material comes from the gold mining where there's actual industrial removal of the permafrost. That's one thing, right? But in other areas along like places like the Old Crow River where we work, there's a lot more permafrost melting, right? And we're starting to hear about one of the first projects I got to work at when I started my job. I started in 2006, 2007. There was a permafrost landslide in a community called Arctic Red River, Tsikajik, in the Northwest Territories. And the young man sent me a photograph of this incredible bison skull and a bunch of other stuff that had come out of the permafrost slide because the melting the permafrost. And there was mummified skin, there was whole limb bones with muscles attached, intestinal things. It was about 15,000 years old. So those kind of those permafrost melting slide events, those landslide events are happening quite a bit more now, and the opportunity to expose more fossils is definitely there. So especially on places like the Arctic coast in Siberia, along the Arctic coastlines where we're seeing a lot of coastal recession, and that's all receding Pleistocene ice age sediment that's melting away.
It gives me really mixed feelings because if you think of a Greek vase that was unearthed somewhere in the Peloponnese and now is in a museum, it's more fragile now than it was when it was in the ground where it was protected. These megafauna and the other things that we're talking about are currently protected by permafrost. If the global climate change is as dramatic as some believe that it will be, this is going to change everything, and these treasures are going to have to be found and preserved because they're not going to be okay just sitting out there in the middle of nowhere.
I totally agree, and that's why, like, I think we kind of approach the work with the gold miners with a bit of urgency, because once it comes out of the ground, it needs to be collected and dealt with, right? So it's like salvage paleontology, and we're doing that in the industrial kind of mining scenario. But as climate change ramps up, warming of permafrost, melting of permafrost ramps up, there's going to need to be more kind of monitoring of that, of those permafrost areas for materials. And like you said, yeah, it's we just hope that we can get to it in time, before the dogs do, or before it gets lost or just buried or forgotten about. Yeah, yeah, no, I totally understand it. Archaeological sites and paleontological objects are probably, they're best protected in the ground. They've been in the ground for thousands of years, and it's really once they get exposed is when the chain of events of needing to deal with it happens. So I wouldn't yeah, yeah.
If you think of what happened when the United States Army invaded Iraq and how great treasures of the museums were looted, the fragility of preserved culture, something that came to us in a big way after 9/11, and now when we think of all the other cataclysmic things that can happen, it really makes you wonder if it's totally responsible to unearth everything that can be unearthed and to get it into a museum. I know that they went around with three-dimensional photography to great places so that under the worst circumstances, we could theoretically replace the Eiffel Tower or the Statue of Liberty or, whatever. But it really gives you a sense of, I don't want to overstate this, but the presumption that we have that we know what we're doing and that we can pull all this stuff out of the ground and then we will take care of it in perpetuity.
For most of this work, it's just doing the best we can under the given circumstances, right? And like you said, once it comes out of the ground, that's when the work starts to make sure that we think we know what we're doing. We're trying to use the best methods, the best approaches that we can to ensure these things are protected and collected, and can survive, in museum collections, for future researchers, because we know that some of the early collections, people that, things like Jefferson's collections, those early collections have scientific value too. So having them stored in a proper facility, protected, and yeah, for future researchers is hugely important, because we know, these kind of cataclysmic events of permafrost loss or natural disasters are just going to get more in the future.
So Jefferson was for 18 years president of the American Philosophical Society, which was started by Benjamin Franklin in 1743. He gave some papers, some learned papers to the APS, one of which was on something he called the Megalonics, which is now regarded as a giant sloth. Are you familiar with this?
Absolutely, yeah, because we have megalonic fossils from Yukon as well, the northernmost end of the range of megalonic.
So he wasn't absolutely accurate, but he did a pretty interesting thing, didn't he?
I like the whole notion that he thought they were some crazy carnivore, like a giant lion or something like that. Because you look at those claws and you think, you know, what else could this be from other than a giant carnivore? But it's really interesting, this kind of serendipitous chain of events that enabled him to actually figure out what they were. And seeing that, I think he saw a monograph in a bookshop and describing that were some fossils being described from South America, and said, that's exactly what I'm looking at from
Albemarle County, Virginia, or the Blue Ridge Mountains. Also, when Alexander von Humboldt came in 1804, and he had been in South America and Mexico, and he wrote this great letter to Jefferson saying, I'd be a mistake for me to go back to Europe without seeing the savant of the Enlightenment in America. So he comes to visit Jefferson, and he tells Jefferson that he saw a mastodon teeth high up in the Andes. And it blew Jefferson's mind away, because he had been worried about what about the seashells that are found on mountains, and trying to figure out, can that even be? Is this a noatic flood? Is it a, what? And he had this sort of contest with Voltaire about what all this meant. Suddenly he hears about mastodon teeth at 11,000 feet, and it just blew his mind.
With megalonics, there's a real close connection with megalonics and mastodons here in Yukon as well, because these are both animals that were forest dwellers. They're browsing, living in forests. But for most of the ice age, it was really cold and dry. We kind of described that environment as the mammoth steppe, this open landscape, grassland landscape that mammoths thrived on. But during these intermittent warming events that we called interglaciations, that's when we had animals like mastodons and giant ground sloths, megalonyx, move north all the way to the Arctic coast of Yukon because forests came back to the Yukon. So the cycle of forests during the warm periods and grasslands during the cold periods really resulted in very different animal communities. So whereas in the southern latitudes, those communities are a little bit more mixed because the environments aren't as extreme. There's a little bit more of a habitat mosaic. But up in the north, it's either when it's cold and dry and there's no trees. But when it's warm like today, we got trees, and then we get these southern animals moving into the north. And that's a really interesting connection because we're having southern animals move northward again today, and as a response to climate change and global warming. So we're getting odd animals moving into the Yukon today. So yeah, the Megalonic Mastodon association of previous interglacials warm periods is really neat.
I was at the Academy of Natural Sciences in Philadelphia a year ago, and we went down into the bowels, and they said, "So you want to see the Megalonic Spoon?" And they open up a drawer, and there it is. It's, Jefferson has his description about it, and it's part of the collection that he had that he presented to the APS.
We have a 3D print of that claw as well. I don't have it on my desk here. It's at the museum, but yeah, Bernard sent me that. You can that's the 3D scan of that is available on that site I sent you. It must have been so amazing to be a person who was interested in these things at that time, because everything was new and everything was, the ceiling was totally open, and you
explained it exactly right, because Jefferson in Notes on Virginia is having this quarrel with the Comte de Buffon in France about degeneracy and so on. And he says, like, he's quoting Buffon now, but he says, "It is possible the world may be 60,000 years old." Think of that. And so then, if that's the case, then the mammoths have been around like yesterday, right? And so he had this short, how do you figure all of the history of geology and flora and fauna creation in a 60,000 year time, which was a radical extension. It was like just a Hail Mary, maybe that big.
And now when we start using words like millions or billions, when you talk to most of the public and you're trying to conceptualize time, it's such a hard thing to grasp, right? To think about our lifetimes, we live 80 or 90 years old, but for geologists to think about early life 3 billion years ago, I think it's really humbling, because it just shows how we're just stardust. We're just stardust, and we all just get recycled.
And we're probably not going to be around in 1 billion years. It's going to take some really interesting reforms. I want to be respectful of your time. I just want to ask a couple quick more questions. First of all, how can people follow your work? What websites, or how can people follow what you're doing?
We have our Facebook account from the Yukon. So the Yukon Beringia Interpretive Center is our local museum that really is dedicated to the story of the Ice Age. So that's the best way to kind of keep updated. We also have an Instagram account that is, so if you follow the Yukon Beringia Center on Instagram or Facebook or Twitter. I don't do Twitter and stuff personally, but our museum updates things that we do all the time.
Dr. Grant Zazula, I so appreciate your taking the time. I know how busy you are. I hope we can talk again, that you're doing extraordinary work. Jefferson would be bowing and trying to find grants from the UN, from anybody to help you in your work. It's extraordinarily important.
I'm a very small piece in a team of very good people, and I have a real pleasure working with some pretty much smarter people than I am, and who do some really amazing things, and I'm just glad I can play a small part in it.
Yeah, but you are known as the Yukon paleontologist. Thanks for talking with me today. So that was my interview with Dr. Grant Zazula, the Yukon paleontologist, one of the most fascinating interviews I've ever had the pleasure to conduct. So we'll see you all next week for another important edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay S. Jenkinson. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.com and on Apple Podcasts. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.com. Bach Cello Suite No. 3 in C Major by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program, Through the